Hello everyone. In today's session, we'll explore the causes and treatment of mental disorders. The title of this chapter is Etiology Treatment of Mental Disorders. The term etiology refers to the study of causation or the causes of something. In Korea, it is often translated as 원인학, and it is a term used across many disciplines such as philosophy, physics, and psychology. In the field of medicine, particularly basic medicine, it is called 병인론, meaning the comprehensive study of the causes of disease. In abnormal psychology, we can apply the term etiology in a similar way, focusing on the underlying causes of mental disorders from a scientific and systematic perspective. Why do mental disorders occur? In truth, it is difficult to pinpoint a single reason. As we discussed in our previous session, the mechanism of the human mind, the way it works, and the complex process behind it are still not fully understood. However, researchers and theorists have proposed various hypotheses, such as each contributing piece of the puzzle. Currently, there are two models that mental health researchers most widely agree upon. First, diathesis stress model, and second, biopsychosocial model. The diathesis stress model, 취약성 스트레스 모델, suggests that mental disorders result from an interaction between genetic predisposition and environmental stressors. The word diathesis means a susceptibility or predisposition to disease. In other words, a particular vulnerability in one's constitution. Another term for this is the stress vulnerability model. Here, vulnerability refers to being easily affected, sensitive, and prone to harm. As shown in this diagram, genetic factor and psychosocial traits acquired during one's upbringing combine to form a vulnerability to mental disorders. Examples include an anxious or depressive temperament, obsessive or perfectionistic tendencies, and heightened sensitivity. However, having these traits alone does not automatically lead to mental disorder. Environmental stressors such as exam, family conflict, financial problems, or traumatic events play a critical role. When these stressors exceed a certain threshold, the likelihood of developing a disorder increases significantly. On the other hand, if stress levels remain manageable, these vulnerabilities may never manifest as a disorder. This means that even someone born with high vulnerability might not develop a mental disorder if their life remains relatively smooth or if they possess strong coping skills. Next, let's look at the biopsychosocial model, 생물 사회 심리적 모델. This model can be seen as an extension of diathesis stress model. It explains that all illnesses not just mental disorders, are influenced by the combination of biological, psychological, and social factors. This is based on holism and system theory. Holism is the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. This perspective, also found in Gestalt psychology, emphasizes that interaction among parts can create synergetic an effect or conversely amplify negative effects. System theory, developed by Austrian biologists, built on holism. It has roots in psychology, biology, philosophy, computer science, and engineering, and has even been applied in fields like social work and organizational studies. From here, we will shift our focus to the treatment of mental disorders. Specifically, from a psychological perspective, we will examine 6 major theoretical approaches: psychoanalytic approach, behavioral approach, humanistic approach, cognitive approach, neurobiological approach, and social-cultural approach. First, the psychoanalytic approach, also known as the psychodynamic approach. This theory was established by Sigmund Freud. Freud argued that all humans, even infants, have sexual desire because these desires are socially and culturally unacceptable. They are repressed, and this repression leads to hysteria, or what we now call certain mental disorders. His therapeutic methods include free association and dream analysis, designed to help patients express repressed desires. As some of you may know, Freud's psychoanalytic theory sparked intense debate, attracting both staunch supporters and strong critics. Amid these controversies, many scholars in Freud's time, as well as later generations, inherited, modified, or expanded his idea. The theorists you see here emerged from that historical and intellectual context. The psychoanalytic theory was both controversial and inspiring, partly because of its striking assumptions. We can summarize them into 3 key points. First, psychic determinism. According to Freud, there is no such a thing as chance. Everything has a psychological cause. Even the content of our dreams or slips of the tongue are expression of repressed unconscious desires. Of course, not everyone agrees with linking every action or mistake to unconscious wishes, and Freud's claims were not proven through strict empirical data. Still, they provide an interesting perspective worth considering. Second, the emphasis on the unconscious and drives aggression. Freud believed that the unconscious is far larger than the conscious mind, often compared to the visible tip of an iceberg. The unconscious contains socially unacceptable desires, urges, and memories that have been censored and repressed. Among these, sexual and aggressive impulses are the most powerful. Third, the importance of the early childhood experience. Freud argued that early interaction with parents laid the foundation of personality development. He introduced the concept of psychosexual stage of development and emphasizes the Oedipus complex as a key process in this stage. Let's look at one of the Freud's central idea, the relationship between the structural model of personality and mental disorders. Freud first proposed the topographical model of the mind, representing psychological structure like a map. Here we see the concepts of conscious and unconscious, often illustrated as an iceberg. The unconscious holds unacceptable sexual desires, violent motives, immoral urges, irrational wishes, and shameful experiences, a storage of repressed desires, emotions, and memories. This is the basic of id psychology. Or drive psychology. However, id psychology alone could not explain complex human behavior. For example, the phenomena of repetition, compulsive, 반복 강박. When someone repeats unpleasant experiences, did not fit neatly into his original theory. This led Freud to revise his model, creating a structural model of personality. In this model, personality consists of three parts. Id represents instinctual drives such as sexual and aggressive impulsive. It seeks immediate gratification and operates on the pleasure principle, ignoring logic, reason, or reality. This is called primary process thinking. Ego, partly conscious, partly unconscious. Freud saw the ego as emerging from the id, borrowing its energy to mediate between the id's desires and the constraint of reality. The ego operates on the reality principle and uses logic and reasoning. This is secondary process thinking. Interestingly, Freud believed that the stronger the ego functions, the weaker the id's influence, reflecting a dynamic struggle between the two. This perspective gave rise to ego psychology. In superego, the internalized values, morals, and ideals acquired primarily from parents. Freud believed it formed during the Oedipal stage through the defense mechanism of identification. The superego consists of two systems, the conscious, which induces guilt, and the ego ideal, which reward with pride. These three components, the id, ego, superego, constantly compete and compromise with one another, which is why Freud's approach is called psychodynamic. A healthy personality is one where the ego can balance the id desire with the superego's moral constraints, adapting to environmental demands. However, if the balance tips too far toward either the id or the superego, conflict intensifies and the ego's ability to mediate is impaired, leading to psychopathology. Now, let's briefly review Freud's theory of personality development. Freud proposed that human psychic energy, called libido, is the driving force of life. If this energy is excessively frustrated or overindulged at a certain stage, it results in fixation, a tendency to seek satisfaction in the stage even in adulthood. Although this theory has been widely criticized, it remains a basic framework in psychoanalytic thought. Freud divided psychosexual development into 5 stages: oral stage, anal stage, phallic stage, latency stage, genital stage. To fully understand psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory, we also need to understand defense mechanisms. A defense mechanism is essentially a shield that the ego uses to protect itself. It is an unconscious strategy developed by the ego to reduce anxiety. Over time, the habitual use of certain defense mechanisms can shape a person's personality. Let's go through some of the key defense mechanisms. Repression, pushing unacceptable desire or conflict into the unconscious so we are no longer consciously aware of them. Rationalization, providing a seemingly logical or acceptable explanation for behavior that actually stem from unacceptable motives. Projection, attributing one's own unacceptable feelings or traits to someone else. These mechanisms are not inherently bad. They can help us to cope in the short term. However, if used excessively or rigidly, they can interfere with healthy functioning and contribute to psychological problems. Finally, let's look at how the psychoanalytic approach applies to treatment. Freud famously said, "Well, it was, ego shall be." In other words, the goal is to strengthen the ego so that it can guide the id, much like a rider guiding a horse, deciding where to go and how fast to move. To achieve this, the first step is to explore the repressed unconscious. Techniques such as free association and dream analysis are used to bringing unconscious materials into awareness. Another important element is working with complex emotions that arise within the relationship between therapist and patient. This is known as transference and resistance analysis. Over time, the patient develops a deep relationship with the therapist and begins to project onto them the feelings they once had toward significant figures in their lifetime. When the therapist recognizes and addresses these projections with sensitivity, the patient can gain valuable insight. The process is called transference analysis. However, simply analyzing transference once is not enough to bring lasting change. The process must be repeated many times, and repeated working through of emotional patterns is called working through. Now let's examine the limitation and implications of psychoanalytic therapy. From a critical perspective, many core concepts in Freud's theory are difficult to verify through empirical research. For example, the unconscious, dream interpretation, and ideas like penis envy. Additionally, Freud's theory has been criticized for placing too much emphasis on Oedipus complex while overlooking the broader range of early relationships with primary caregivers. Despite these limitations, psychoanalytic therapy has important implications. It moves beyond a purely medical model of mental illness, integrating psychological explanation for abnormal behavior. Moreover, it lays the foundation for many forms of modern psychotherapy, influencing numerous therapeutic approaches that follows.